C-Beams is crossing the line from a space game prototype to a self-sustaining universe, because it now has the foundations for emergent encounters. Now what the devs have been showing off here is, at the moment, the space game stops being a collection of just parts and bits and pieces and becomes a full-on game, or at least the foundations for that. And what's more interesting perhaps is that C-Beams is not trying to convince you that it's the next big space game that's going to save the genre. Instead, what you've got here is a game where you fly one ship into a collapsing system because that's where the work is. You take contracts, you strip wrecks, you fight on when you have to, and you run when you should have done so earlier. And what really stood out to me with C-Beams so far at least is that it's not a game that's trying to sell you a game of scale. It's not trying to sell you a massive galaxy, an impressive looking map, and it's not trying to be your permanent second life. Instead, it's putting together all the pieces to make for a very engaging game set in space where salvaging and going into dangerous star systems is the aim of the game. And here's the real interesting part. The ambition of C-Beams is not there to outscale other space games that you may have seen. Instead, it's here to outlast their first impressions. It's a game world then that leans into a harsher, much more grounded science fiction tone where progress is earned through understanding the game world you're in, not simply by unlocking the next toy on a tech tree. Over time then, the developers aim for a universe that rewards patience, curiosity and restraint. And whilst I've got you here, if you haven't done so already, please do subscribe. It massively helps this channel and also helps out games like this, getting them to a lot more people's attention than it might otherwise do. What you might be really curious to hear then is that the game is being developed by Distant Light Games, and it's a team that's led by the YouTuber known as Leveled Cap Gaming. You may have heard of him. He's big into space games and other such things and has a huge collection of videos and a pretty large YouTube channel to boot. They've been working on the game for 2 years now, and it really appears to be coming along nicely. Now let me tell you about the thing that really interested me in the recent devlog, and here's a great example. Things in the game are not just there to simply be there. For example, a derelict ship is not just a prop. A derelict ship instead is an emergent point of interest. It can be a story seed, it can be the beginning of I was heading towards somewhere else, but then I saw this something. It's a feeling that not many other games capture, and it's basically the holy grail of space games in terms of design and philosophy. This is a premise then that is infused right throughout the whole game. Instead of things just being simple gameplay mechanics, they go one step further and make them deeper, more interesting. Another example then that highlights the direction here is something pretty simple, pretty straightforward, uninteresting on the surface. It's loot tables, but don't go away, don't drop out, because loot tables here are part of a bigger picture, because they also connect into the third piece, which is debris and scrap. So floating metal, floating scrap metal, collidable debris, larger debris, which is also being tested right now, and little bits of physical clutter, all of these turn empty space into something that has texture. That means space isn't entirely empty, there's actually something going on here, and yes, on the surface this might just be considered ambience. Some people may just think it makes the world look cooler. But that's not the real point here. The point isn't just visuals. The real point is that it makes space readable. It makes movement and exploration feel like you're navigating through something rather than flying through a void until the next waypoint. And when you connect those three different foundations together, inventory, salvageable derelicts, as well as the physical layer of debris and scrap, well, you can start seeing a bigger picture starting to form. Because whereas a lot of games might consider this stuff content, it's not strictly speaking content here. What you've got instead is built-in scaffolding that lets the universe create meaningful encounters for you. Because look at it this way, once you have derelicts, once they exist, once loot exists, and once scrap exists, you suddenly have the beginning of a loop that can self-sustain. You can fly, you find, you salvage, you trade, you upgrade, you take on a different job, you get pulled off course, and you stumble across something that you didn't plan for. And that's how space stops feeling totally empty. That's how you end up here with a readable and structured environment. What makes this particularly interesting is that they're clearly aligning their next step around the same idea. And because it's this step that where a lot of space games fail. Think of Elite Dangerous and how hard it is to onboard into that, how hard the new player experience is, and we can probably think of a lot of other space games that have this exact same problem over the first few hours, and it's the point where a lot of people just bounce off the game and never return. So the team here are talking about wrapping up the tutorial and demo system so that it transitions into the open world gameplay. And it's precisely there that a lot of space games actually fail. Some because, like I say, they simply have a totally rubbish onboarding experience, and others because they might well build for a very good first hour and they can build for a strong onboarding experience, but the moment you leave that guided experience and find yourself in the real universe, it can be very difficult, and a lot of players find themselves dropping off here. Because in these games, the real universe often doesn't have enough systems to actually support you at keeping yourself engaged with the game. So, when the team here say that they've been bridging the tutorial into an open world, and that year 3 of development is going to be about building the world and mission system, what they're really saying here, what it appears to me that they're saying, is that we're ready to stop showing you features in isolation and start showing how the universe itself can hold together. And as you listen to the devlogs, I'll link the most recent one in the video description below, you'll find that this is very likely, whilst they keep mentioning refinement, whilst they keep talking about fleshing out systems, diving deep into AI, or talking about more interesting combat profiles, improving physics, all things that, are hard to show in a devlog, but they're pretty obvious the moment you play the game, because once you're actually in the game, once the world itself becomes systemic, because that's the way it's been designed, once you're not just there for a few curated encounters, everything else within the universe needs to be more robust. It needs to hold itself up and hold itself together. In other words, the AI itself has to make sense. Physics need to feel consistent right across the board. Collisions in ship to ship or collisions with asteroids or other objects, well, they need to behave according to the laws and rules that the game has set up. So yes, the universe has to remain both legible, as readable, and, intuitive the more things start happening within the game. And that's to me where it feels as though C-Beams is actually getting more interested as it heads into its 3rd year of development. At this point, it's starting to look a lot like a space game that can actually generate stories rather than just keep showing you content. And at this point in the genre's history, the space game genre, we really need developers who are looking at things in a more long-term perspective. So what we have here, hopefully at least, is a game where you can jump in and it impresses you right off the bat, but also it has hooks that allow you for the game to become another long-term obsession. This is something that we're not seeing enough of when it comes to space games. And whilst yes, at the moment it's a little bit too early to tell whether or not this is going to be that type of game, we've still got quite a bit more development to go on that, is every indication is showing that it does have a potential and promise for this. In fact, the recent devlogs are showing that this is very likely to be the case. So that brings us to the end of this video. A whole load of information there on C-Beams, looking pretty good to me at least. Thanks for watching this video all the way through. There is another one on the screen right here. Do take care, and I'll catch you next time.